Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. What's the secret to a perfect power ballad? It may seem silly, but they're one of the most deceptively difficult kinds of songs to write. A great power ballad is an extremely delicate balancing act between emotional sincerity on the one hand and over-the-top drama on the other. Without the drama, it's just a normal ballad, but if you lose the emotional core, it becomes unbearably cheesy, and it's really easy to lose the emotional core. These days, power ballads tend to be treated as punchlines, products of an era where everything was so extreme that no one realized just how goofy they were, but I don't think that's fair. Sure, the 80s got a bit carried away with them, but power ballads can be pretty great if they're done right, and there's no better example of that than Aerosmith's breakout hit, Dream On. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. With the iconic arpeggio pattern played by a guitar and a harpsichord, and the first thing I want to talk about is that pair of instruments. Steven Tyler's electric harpsichord is a really interesting, distinctive sound, and blending it with Joe Perry's guitar like this creates a unique tone that's instantly recognizable as Dream On. It sounds like a tinny, almost toy piano-like version of a guitar, familiar but not quite right, and it gives this intro a bizarre, otherworldly quality that you couldn't achieve with a simple guitar on its own. The dreamlike ambience of the piece relies on that harpsichord to really make it pop. As for the chords, we start on F minor and then go to C minor. We're in the key of F, so this is 1 and 5, and the use of 5 minor here establishes a clear natural minor tonality. This gives it a sense of directionlessness, like the music is just sort of wandering around aimlessly, creating some distance between the listener and the scene they're listening in on. That distance, in turn, implies depth. The song isn't about a single event. It feels to me like an old man reflecting back on his entire life, which is impressive because Steven Tyler apparently wrote it when he was 14. Anyway, we're gonna see a lot of things that reinforce that sense of distance and reflection, and the use of natural minor is a big one. From there we go into the second bar with D half diminished 7 and then D flat major 7 flat 5, C sus flat 2, E flat 13 voiced without a root. Okay, this is one of those situations where trying to work out the exact right names for the chords isn't actually helpful. It's not really a chord thing at all, it's a voice leading thing. This whole part is built out of 3 melodic lines. Those lines happen to start by spelling out recognizable chords, which grounds us in a specific tonality, but then they just keep going and chord labels stop being useful, so let's look at each line on its own. We'll start with the lowest one, which is just playing a drone on C. This is the 5th of the key, and keeping it steady through the whole progression has a sort of anchoring effect. They can do a lot of weird stuff on top, but everything keeps returning to that same familiar C. And to really drive this drone home, they also offset it rhythmically. The other 2 lines hit on the beats, but this one happens on the 8th notes in between, letting it occupy its own metric space all by itself. If we shift it over to sound with the other 2, it gets buried beneath them, and you don't really feel how it's just sitting still. It's noteworthy, though, that the drone here is on C, the 5th, not F, the root. In fact, only one of these 4 chords contains an F at all, so while it's certainly the root of the key, it winds up getting lost in this incessant driving C, again creating a bit more distance. If F is our harmonic home, then we're not actually living there, we're peeking through the window from the outside. Moving on to the top line, we're sliding back and forth between A flat, the 3rd, and G, the 2nd. This gives us some melodic motion, but only over the span of a half step, so it's still pretty restrained. More importantly though, the line provides a sense of harmonic motion. The 3rd is a stable point in the key, while the 2nd isn't, so we're getting a nice mild cycle of tension and release. The 2 notes belong to the 1 chord and the 5 chord respectively, and since this is the highest and thus most prominent line harmonically, we get the sense that we're just drifting back and forth between those 2 chords, even though that's only actually true for the first half. It gives the harmony a recognizable shape even as the details get weird. And finally, we get to the middle line. This one starts on the root and then just walks down the scale, or, well, almost. D natural isn't in F minor, but including a major 6 like this isn't all that uncommon in these sorts of walkdowns. My best explanation is that by adding the extra note, you keep yourself from walking down too far. If we just did 4 notes in the scale, we'd end up on C, and then we'd be jumping from 5 back to 1, which is a whole big thing. We're not trying to set up a resolution, we're just trying to vibe, so ending on the flat 6 lets us return to 1 with a nice little hop instead. It keeps the line from looking like it's trying too hard. We can also consider these notes in relation to the top line. After all, the two parts are played at the same time, but the top part repeats every bar, while the middle line is a 2-bar pattern, and those 2 bars have 2 very different relationships with the notes above them. In the first half, they're harmonized in thirds, a nice consonant interval, which is why we were able to find some pretty easy chord names for them. In the second bar, though, they switch to harmonizing the top line in tritones, one of the most dissonant intervals. In a jazz or classical context, we might expect these tritones to point us somewhere, setting up a resolution of some kind, but here they don't. Or, I mean, I guess you could view this last one as like a rootless E-flat 7, which could then resolve back to F minor, but that's not how I hear it. The strength and relative prominence of that repeating top line makes these feel more like twisted, less comfortable versions of the 1 and 5 chords we already heard. And before we move on, there's one other line to consider, Tom Hamilton's bass. The first time through the progression, he sits on F, providing an alternate drone and making sure you're hearing the correct root. Tyler and Perry are really hammering that C, so without this bass part, the first 2 chords might sound like 4 and 1 instead of 1 and 5, and you lose that sense of distance created by placing the drone on the 5th. The second time, though, Hamilton drops to a lower register and joins the middle line on its walk down, to emphasize that sense of motion. But okay, I've written over 1,000 words on the first 6 seconds of this song, so let's move on. The next thing we hear is this, which is pretty easy to explain now that we understand how these parts work. The low C keeps hammering away and the other 2 lines trade roles. The middle one provides stability by just sitting on F, while the top line creates motion by walking from A flat to B flat to C. This rising line creates a nice contrast with the descending figure from before, and while C still isn't the root, we're so comfortable with it from the drone that this feels like an arrival anyway, a point they drive home by breaking the pattern and hanging on it for 2 full beats. This figure shows up occasionally throughout the song, usually serving as a way to release tension and let you catch your breath between sections. From there we get the main line again, then visit the 4 chord. Although the arpeggio still sounds like it's trying to play F minor. All those notes fit over a B flat chord too, so it doesn't really clash, but that slight disagreement makes the harmony here feel a lot more interesting. That leads into this. And again, let's break it down by line. The most obvious is Perry doing this driving half-step trill between D flat and C. This is a lot like that A flat G part from earlier, but this time the dissonant note is the one positioned on the beats, while the stable one is pushed off to the 8ths in between. That switch makes the line feel a lot less comfortable, especially given how important that C has become. This part also shows up throughout the song, again serving as a transition, this time for when we need to build tension. Underneath it though, Hamilton is doing something really interesting. He's playing his own half-step line, but instead of acknowledging the D-flat C part, this one walks up from E-flat to E, and then it arrives back at F. Perry is stuck in a holding pattern on the 5th, so Hamilton takes on the responsibility of dragging us back to the root. Again, we get some parts providing motion while others sit still, and that tension between different kinds of directionality helps keep the song from ever really feeling settled. Someone's always going somewhere. As soon as Hamilton gets back to F, though, he becomes the one sitting still while Perry launches into a big run up and down the harmonic minor scale, ending once again on C and setting up the verse. Instrumentally, this is basically those first 2 bars looped over and over, cementing that sense of ambient directionlessness while Tyler starts singing. Every time that I look in the mirror. It's a pretty straightforward melody. It starts on C, ends on A flat, and along the way it hits a high F for emphasis, so the whole thing is basically just an elaborated F minor triad. The next line is the same thing again, except this time he ends on B flat instead. All these lines in my face getting clearer. And again, this is pretty standard pop melody writing. Doing the same line twice but ending on a stable note the first time and an unstable note the second is a really common trick, but it's also really effective. The first line outlines the shape of the melody, and the second subverts that shape, and thus your expectations, to create a sense of surprise and imply further motion. If he sang the B flat right away, every time that I look in the mirror, it wouldn't work nearly as well. You need the A-flat first so the B-flat feels wrong enough to be interesting. But just because it's a simple melody doesn't mean it's a bad one. It does what the song needs it to do. Like, notice how much like the arpeggio, the melody seems to mostly revolve around C, not F. This taps into that same floaty, ungrounded feeling. In fact, it's not until the fourth line that he actually sings an F over the F chord. For most of the verse, the only time he sings the root is when the band is somewhere else, so they feel more like non-harmonic accents than true melodic resolutions. It's a really nice effect, and it only works because it's such a simple melody. Anyway, the verse ends with this, which is a play on that harmonically ambiguous second bar, but this time it's a bit more aggressive. We start with D half diminished 7, then slide down to C major. Up to now, our C chords have been minor, so switching to major here is a clear sign that the song is going somewhere. The major 5 chord is a way more directional sound, so while the C minors were mostly taking us away from F, this C major is pretty strongly pointing us back. Instead of an F though, we go back to D half diminished, then this, the last chord of the main pattern. Given the D flat in the bass, I'm gonna call it D flat major 7 flat 5, but again, I don't think the label really matters here. The point is, it's an extra passing chord inserted in between the D chord and the upcoming C7, mimicking the descending line from the verse and pushing the 5 chord to the beginning of the next bar. That brings us to the pre-chorus, where Perry's back on that D-flat C trill from the intro, but everything else around him is different. For starters, instead of walking up to F, Hamilton is just pounding out C, which further emphasizes just how gnarly those D-flats really are. Here, listen to the two parts together. That's a lot of tension, but remember, the way this song works is that some parts are always static while others are moving. Perry and Hamilton are stuck in a loop, and Tyler's vocals are holding a note, so where's our motion coming from? Well, let's check out the harpsichord. This is a whole harmonic journey. We start on C, the chord implied by both the previous section and the bass. After a couple beats though, Tyler seems to get confused by the D-flats Perry is playing and slides up to D-flat major. 2 beats after that, he concludes that neither of them is right and it's actually a D major chord somehow, and then finally he settles back on C7, the chord it was probably supposed to be the whole time. This is an amazing build-up, starting on the obvious chord and then just slowly drifting further and further out of step with the rest of the band, before locking back in just in time for a big resolution to the chorus. Harmonically, the chorus is another play on that descending line. We start on the root, walk down to the flat 6, then walk back up. It's covering the same range, but this time there's no out-of-key notes and no leaps. It's all extremely even motion, with no particular part feeling especially noteworthy, which helps create another form of musical distance. It feels timeless and wistful because it doesn't really have anywhere to be. Every chord transition is basically the same. It's moving, but it's not going anywhere. Melodically, the first chorus sticks largely to 3 notes, F, E flat, and C. I know nobody knows where it comes and where it goes. It's actually a smaller range than the verse that preceded it, which is weird. Usually choruses are these big, bombastic affairs, but the restrained melody makes this feel more introspective and mature. It's not really about showing off, not yet at least. The second chorus, though, shifts things up a notch. Sing with me, sing for the year, sing for the laugh, and sing for the tear. It's still roughly the same total range, but this time it's higher, and honestly, it's a pretty different shape too. Like, not unrecognizable, but it's definitely not the same melody, which is really cool. It makes us feel like a whole new section, even though structurally, it's basically the same thing. At the end of the second chorus, they switch things up, replacing the last bar with this, which again is a combination of 2 lines. The bass has switched back to following the original walk down, but the guitar contrasts that with a walk up the scale. This line gives us a sense of rising tension both by literally rising and by visiting a series of increasingly complex chord tones. We start on the root, then as the bass moves down we go up to the 3rd of the new chord. From there we get a flat 5, and then finally a 13th, which isn't really a part of the chord, although again, who knows what this chord even is. This tension ramp eventually delivers us into another D-flat C trill, and then we wind up in the interlude. Here, Perry plays this, which is basically just arpeggiating an F minor triad with that same A flat, B flat, C walk-up we saw in the intro. In response, Hamilton plays this, which is also from the intro. It's the walk-up he did underneath the D-flat C trill the first time we heard it. Reinterpreting these familiar lines gives the interlude a sense of cohesion and purpose. Too often, interludes are just extra fragments of musical ideas, but this is built entirely out of things we've already heard, so it really feels like it belongs in this song. It wouldn't work nearly as well in another piece of music. That brings us back to the chorus again, which ends the same way, but this time it tosses us into the bridge, and if there's one part of Dream On that everyone remembers, it's the bridge. Again, we're doing another walk-up. This song loves walking. This one starts on the 4 chord, which is always a great way to start a bridge, and then we just walk up the scale in power chords until we make it back to 1, play a guitar fill, then do it again. I'm not really gonna talk much about the fills themselves. They're cool and all, but like most guitar fills, he's basically just noodling on the blues scale. What really makes these sound epic, though, is Joey Kramer's drums. For the first 4 beats of each fill, he plays these short stop-time stabs on the cymbals, before joining in with a fill of his own. The stabs add a lot of weight to the beginning of the guitar part, and then the drum fill flows perfectly back into the next statement. If he just kept playing through, this fill would be pretty forgettable. But with the right support, it sounds absolutely amazing. Or actually, quick side note, because I know I'll get comments on it if I don't, I'm not saying Perry's fill was bad. It's not. It's extremely hard to sound bad when you're playing the blues scale. It's just that, as a listener, it's easy to give too much credit to the most obvious instrument, and while the guitar is front and center, I don't think it's the one doing the heavy lifting here. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, after the 3rd time, instead of a guitar fill, they drop down to a low F and walk up again from there, ending on C to set up a return to the final chorus. It's a brilliant use of a really simple idea, visiting every chord in the scale with this constantly rising energy and tying back into all the walk-ups and walk-downs we've heard throughout the song. It's interesting that they hit every chord though, because the melody doesn't seem to notice. It's singing pretty much the same thing over every single one, dream on, starting on A flat and walking down to F. This lets us experience the same 3 notes in every harmonic context the key has to offer, but the repetition ensures that it always sounds appropriate even when it doesn't seem like they should fit. This is also helped by the use of power chords. Fewer notes in the accompaniment means fewer chances for the melody to clash. And of course, on that last walk-up, when the band drops down to the low F, Tyler jumps up an octave, belting out a terrifyingly high A flat. I don't have much to say on this. The impact of jumping an octave is obvious. It's the most memorable moment in the song, but I don't think you really need me to explain why, so instead, here's a quick personal anecdote. Back in college, I had to take a vocal ensemble class. We did this song, and I wound up singing this part in this register, because my metal background meant I could hit the notes with more power than any of the sopranos, which makes Dream On the highest thing I've ever sung in a live performance. That's not really relevant to my analysis, but I wanted to reminisce about the notes I used to have back when I was, singing regularly. I had a life before this, before the elephants took over. Anyway, that's basically it. We get another chorus, then fade out on that D-flat C trill. It's a fitting end to such an ambiguous, meandering song, leaving us with no clear resolution, no obvious conclusion, nothing but the questions raised by the lyrics. Dream On is an incredibly intricate piece of music, and the craft and care that went into writing it make listening to it a deeply powerful experience. And hey, thanks for watching. As always, this song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.